think we're good to go. Good morning and welcome to Secure Impact's webinar on communicating cyber risk to the board. Now, this is a really challenging topic, but we have a mix of industries and company sizes with us today. So the panel will discuss strategies that are more generally applicable. We all know there's no one size that fits all, there's no silver bullet, but the panel of experts are here today to provide at least one or two practical strategies that you can take away to report to your stakeholders or to add or to start your toolkit as such. So it's promising to be a really, really exciting topic. And firstly, some introductions. So I'm Georgia Cacace. I'm General Manager at Secure Impact. And for those of you who are new to us today, Secure Impact is a cybersecurity consultancy that specializes in services from security assessments, red teaming and pen testing through to IR tabletops and bespoke advisory. The important folks are yet to be introduced. So starting with Sarah Armstrong Smith, she is the Chief Security Advisor at Microsoft and specializes in disaster recovery, crisis management, and business continuity. Now, you should listen to Sarah because over the years, she has successfully guided a range of businesses and stakeholders through digital attacks and taught them how to protect their data, including the London Stock Exchange Group, Fujitsu, Microsoft, of course, and the numerous SMEs that she currently advises as a board member herself. Now, a regular nominee for some of the most inspiring type awards, when I asked Sarah to pinpoint a particular high point of her career, she said it was publishing her first book, which was a 2023 bestseller, Effective Crisis Management. Now, this explores some of the traits needed to be an effective leader and no doubt holds some key stakeholder communication strategies in there. Next one coming out soon, so watch this space on that front. Moving on to Lee. Lee Whatford is a seasoned leader with over 25 years in information security and risk management. Now, you should listen to Lee because he has successfully led a vast range of organizations and stakeholders through some of the most challenging organizational changes, but resulting in successful business-aligned cyber transformation. Now, this includes major household brands and high-profile businesses. He's been the head of InfoSec at Whitbread, NFU Mutual, and then most recently, CISO at Domino's, and now Director of Cybersecurity at Royal Mail. We've discussed cyber risk management before, and Lee has a specific and quite enlightened insight to this, which leverages his highly commercial approach to leading cybersecurity functions. Last but not least, we've got James Line, who's founder at Secure Impact and numerous other successful companies, as well as CTO of SANS Institute. Now, James has advised some of the world's highest profile executives at major enterprises and leading national security organizations, enabling them to better understand and manage their risk. He's a known industry advisor featuring on TED Talks and a regular keynote speaker. Now, when I asked James about his career highlights, he said, aside from enabling organizations to better protect themselves, it's educating and training hundreds of thousands of students to be the next generation of experts to do good in security. We've got quite the panel, so thank you so much for joining us. And just before we kick off, a reminder that this is your session. It's meant to be super practical, so please ask questions throughout. They can be submitted through the discussion via the Q&A box, I believe, at the bottom of your screen. And lastly, this session is going to be recorded. We'll send you a link after the webinar of the recording, as well as some useful handouts of information. And lastly, actually, if you have any models or resources that you found helpful, also please do drop these in the chat function, and we'll include these in the handout to share with the cybersecurity community. Excellent. Okay, so getting started. James, could you kick us off on this topic? Why are we here? Why is it important to discuss this? Why is it relevant now?
Yeah, I'll offer a couple of thoughts, and then I'm going to hand over to our two practitioners here living it right now, who will have lots to say on this, no doubt. Look, for me, we spent years in cybersecurity, sat in our corner of IT, in the corner of the data center somewhere, moaning that we wanted a seat at the table, complaining that security had to be owned by the business and business integrated, not just a technical function configuring firewalls and deploying patches, which is right. I mean, that is the effective way to think about security spend, the right level of security, to kind of integrate it with fellow leaders. And over the years, by virtue of high-profile breaches, continued lobbying, some cocktail of each of those, we got what we wanted. We have that seat at the table. And for a lot of security leaders, they found themselves in that seat and they've gone, oh crap, what do I do now? Because the skills to manage risk, to communicate risk, to work with boards, to have that seat at the table business-wise are quite different to some of the technical leadership skills we were executing before. And of course, both sides of this are important. So for me, whether you're interested in job preservation when inevitably a breach comes along, or you want to right size your security budget and genuinely calibrate it to the level that makes sense for your type of organization, managing and communicating risk and working with the board or your security leadership team is just a crucial skill set of today's security leaders. I think that's why we're here today. And before I kind of invite my co-panelists here to kind of add some color to this, I would say that this isn't easy. This is 50% art and 50% science. There are frameworks, there are tools, there are good practices to follow. There's also a lot of judgment. There's a lot of relationship building. There's building an understanding with people that think differently to our technical teams. And that can make this tricky to calibrate in different organizations. I don't think it's a framework where you tick some things off, you're like, mission accomplished, I manage risk well. It's a constant calibrating thing we have to talk about and mature as an industry. But the stakes have never been higher for businesses in terms of the risk of breach. And frankly, never as high for us as individuals who've now earned this seat at the table that we asked for to do this job effectively. So, that for me is why we're here, building robust cyber risk management, the art and science of that, learning to communicate effectively with stakeholders so we can drive towards the right size, calibration of security. And when it goes wrong and there's a crisis, folks are on our side as opposed to throwing rocks at us. But Sarah Lee, I bet you've got a few thoughts on that. You can even violently disagree with me if you like. That's okay too. But Sarah, perhaps you want to jump in first. You nodded more than Lee, so you seem like the friendly starting point.
Oh yeah, thanks, James. I think that's a really great opener. But I think let's address the elephant in the room first and foremost. So. No, we're talking about boards, and I think people who are sat on a board are clever people. That's why they're on a board. And so they understand risk, they understand maybe the principles of cybersecurity, why it's so important. But arguably, if we think back in the last 3 years, just how much change there's been. Now, obviously, we've been in a global pandemic, but we have seen a mass acceleration to the cloud. We've seen so many different businesses who are reevaluating their business models. So they're investing in smart technologies, hybrid working, opening new markets. All of these things are really exciting, but they all carry an element of risk. And I think even in the last couple of years, not only have we seen a global pandemic, we have seen one of the most sophisticated cyber attacks that we've ever seen. That's SolarWinds. And I know Lee will probably have a view on that as well. But also we've seen the war in Ukraine and just how cybersecurity has been embedded into all of those things. But I think you made a really excellent point, James, as well, with regards to the difference between the reactive element of risk and the proactive element of risk as well. And I think it's really important now we have this assume compromise mindset. For the best will in the world, the investments that people have already made in different technologies, processes, and doing all of these things, you have to assume you are going to be attacked. And that's every company of every size in every sector. So I think first and foremost, it's a mindset change. And from a board's perspective in particular, it's a really, as you sort of mentioned, it's about that brand protection first and foremost. It's the reputation, understanding the financial risk, but not just the risk of today, but also if you have this kind of major incident, it's the reputation damage. It's the fact that some of the impact of some of those major incidents can go on for months, if not years. And so, people have a big memory when it comes to how you respond to an incident, not just the fact you've had an incident. So I think there's kind of a few things to unpick there as we go through the rest of the conversation.
Yes, yeah, I think there are a few things to unpick. Days of conversation there, isn't there? I think I mean, there's a huge amount going on. It's incomprehensible at times. How are we supposed to deal with all of that stuff? You put your practitioner hat on, and I look at Royal Mail, and it's a huge world. There's so much stuff going on. Hugely reliant on OT, legacy all over the place, clouds coming at us like a freight train because that's what's happening. And how do you unpick the threats, the risk, the impacts, the tech? How do you actually kind of put all this together and have a conversation with somebody that doesn't actually know anything about any of it, apart from we want to be able to get parcels from A to B in the greenest of fashions? And there's a huge void there. There's a massive void there. So I think when I look at how do we start working with the board, I think it's an ongoing education process. You're absolutely right. It's not about tech. And James's earlier point is we've been sat in tech and we talk tech, and I'm not particularly good at talking tech, but my team talks tech, and that's great. And we need to talk tech because it's largely where we're putting our controls. But we've got to be able to completely divorce ourselves from that and talk about risk. And even when we talk about risk, there's a huge challenge there because different businesses talk about risk in different ways. You talk about an insurance, you talk to an insurance company board about risk. They live and breathe risk. That's all they do. They're a business that thrives and survives on risk and understanding risk and pricing risk into a market. Domino's, different concept of risk altogether. The risk there is
of too little cheese on a pizza is a serious risk. I'm just saying.
It is. It completely is. A misplaced pepperoni slice, and all of a sudden, the world's going to end. Absolutely. But seriously, it is that different. So I think for me, really, the overarching aim of all of this really has to be to understand the business, not just understand what they care about. And we talk about that quite a lot in terms of what assets do they care about, what are their key business processes that they have that they really care about, and what is that technology stack that underpins the ability to run that key business process. Because that's fundamentally where we should be. If there's stuff they don't care about, then should we be applying the same rigor, the same controls, the same investment that we do within some of their key business processes? So I think there's generally a move in the industry now and a general understanding that is the case. It has to be the case, especially when we look at cloud and segmenting the cloud into different sort of buckets of environments depending on the risk profile of the data that we're putting in there, who's got access to them, and all of that sort of stuff. But it's actually really about understanding the business. It's how does it work? It's what is the chief marketing officer's target? What is their personal target? What are they carrying? What's that business strategy? What are they actually trying to achieve over the next 3 to 5 years? And that's the bit that often we miss out on because we kind of look at this technology stack kind of approach, or even worse, we don't look at that, and or we try and protect everything all at the same time and fail. But if we understand the business, but we understand the people that run the business, and that's key as well. It's a personal thing. We can't build relationships with the business without really kind of taking the CFO out for a coffee and saying, "Can you just talk to me about what your concerns are in the business? Where are you bothered? What are you
Lee,
doing?
I want to.
What are your targets? How are you doing these things?" Because then we can relate individually. The more we can relate individually to the people that run the business and understand their world, the more we can relate to their world, and the more we can help them understand what it is in their language to what it is that we need to do. And that's the biggest gap, I think.
Lee, I know George will move us on in a second, but I do want to underline that point there because it so reflects my experiences. If you start looking at your constituents in the board and try to be selfish on their behalf, good things happen. If you stop kind of saying, okay, let me express risk in the most business, professional, homogenized way I can, you start saying, okay, I'm the CFO. How does it affect me? I'm the CMO. How does it affect me personally? If you assume every person is selfish, it actually really helps you think about their interests, how to communicate them, how to get them to understand the risk. And you're not calling them selfish by doing that. It's just a really effective mental model to communicate to each of those constituents. I really want to underline that point because it works, whether it's a board or a senior management team, depending on your station there. That's a really key tip to success. And I can see George is about to get the sheep crook out for me, but I did want to underline that because it's just a great tip you're making there.
Yeah, no, absolutely. I mean, we're talking about serious fundamental consequences such as financial loss and reputational damage. What is the role of the board in owning this risk? How to communicate to them, how not to communicate to them? Who owns this risk that has such fundamental impact? I'll come to you, Lee, again, if I may.
Not me. It's my first comment on that one. Thanks very much, but I'm not making the camp for it. The CISO lives at different levels within the business. It'd be buried in IT, living under CTOs, through to CIOs and living in IT, but having some relationship with the business to actually kind of living directly in the business. And I think that fundamentally kind of puts a tilt on how much accountability the CISO has, but ultimately the board of directors, the people that run the business, it's their risk. I don't pay the bill if it's the ransomware guys come knocking. I'm not fixing the IT stuff. IT are fixing the IT stuff, but the CFO is ultimately paying the bill. And ultimately, this comes down to numbers. Whether it's whether it's a response to to an ATP attack that doesn't actually involve any sort of data loss or system outage at the end of it, but we found them, we need to kick them out. They can be expensive exercises. They can be exercises that delay the business opening new outlets, or have a direct financial impact to the business. It doesn't mean it's public. But I think it's about understanding ultimately this is down to numbers, and it is going to cost the business every time we have a cyber incident. Whether it's a small amount of numbers because we catch it pretty early on, but we've still got to mobilise a team. We've still potentially got to pay for third-party resource to come in and support. We've still got to do that stuff, and the more it drives forwards, and obviously the deeper it becomes, and and then ultimately in sort of data loss or public problems or ransomware problems, did the issue that Royal Mail have just had, there is a cost to it. So this has to be a business-owned problem.
Got it. And Sarah, if I can come to you, how should this be positioned to the board? We understand that this is where the ownership lies. What are the strategies that you've seen in, communicating this?
Yeah, I would just echo what Lee said. I think there's a misconception that security is the CISO's problem. But actually it covers every single member of the board, as we sort of said, and Lee really articulated well, that it is a business risk, it's a business problem. And I think the challenge is how what we touched on at the beginning of the call, where we've kind of got the cybersecurity is synonymous with technology. And what I kind of see is that a lot of the discussions, a lot of the issues that are being discussed are either from a CISO, CIO, CTO perspective, but they don't tend to bridge across the full end-to-end of the board. So what do HR need to know? What do the risk team need to know? What does the audit committee need to know? What does marketing need to know? Because ultimately it touches on every single aspect of every one of those people's jobs. And so the outcome of some of these things may end up and from a technology perspective, but technology, as we said, is only one part. It's a huge part is the people, it's the education, it's the awareness, it's understanding business processes in particular. So let's say, for example, if you have a phishing email that comes in and it's trying to convince somebody to change a bank account on an invoice, then somebody in finance needs to understand that and needs to make sure that they have the right business processes and understand how these type of emails, they're worded, they're trying to manipulate people, they're trying to get people to take action. But we could look at the same across each different business area. And I think really, in terms of the articulation of risk and where does that risk sit, what I see happens near across every company, more so at some of the larger enterprises, where they already have risk and audit committees. Every quarter, they may have a risk register and they communicate the top 3, top 10 risks, etc. And I would hazard a guess that cybersecurity is probably in the top 3, at minimum top 10. But what I kind of see in some feedback that I have, sometimes from those people who say, look, it's every quarter we say the same thing. We'll be saying it month on month, quarter on quarter, almost year on year, that cybersecurity is a massive threat. And we need to make investments in all of these different areas, but it's just kind of hitting a brick wall with regards either the lack of understanding with the true issues, true risk that they're facing, but the kind of the so what is how do you actually articulate the impact and how do you then articulate what it is you need to do as a result of that. So just communicating that you have a risk is one thing, but what are you expecting as a result? And as we sort of said, that's going to go across the entirety of the company, but it's being able to therefore articulate 2 things. It's really, really quite easy. So the what if an attacker was able to get into this part of our business, they're able to get access to this particular part of our data, and then what can they do with that data? So what's the impact? And the real challenge is articulating that impact in a way that each member of the board understands and appreciates, and then can make some decisions about how high risk or not they perceive that against all the other risks. And I think it's important to mention it's a balancing act ultimately, because they have multiple risks. And I think it's fair to say cybersecurity is just one of many. But from our perspective, what we're talking about as CISOs or security leaders, how do we make sure that the business understand the risk, and if they are making decisions, that they've made the decision in the right way and the right outcomes, even if security isn't the thing that gets all the budget, that they understand and they accept the risk in terms of what they're doing and how they're doing it. So it really is that balancing act.
Yeah, I'll just add to that if that's all right. I'll jump in. We are still making risk up as we go along. It's all very sort of subjective. Yes, there is. You're absolutely right. There's a what if and the business impact, but I think we've got to get much closer to the threats and there's the likelihood versus sort of impact bit. I think you're right. I think we've got to get more specific to the business. I remember looking at the toy a while ago. I'm saying, well, what we do is we take the latest Ponemon impact of a breach statistic and we add that into your thing, and then that's how we calculate the impact of a breach. So I'm like, well, that's just rubbish. You just can't, because no board in the right mind is going to sit there and say a generic industry sort of thing, unless it applies to my business. I'm just not going to pay any attention to it. So I think the impact thing, I think you're right, but we're still making up the likelihood bit as we go along. What's the likelihood of being hit by a bit of ransomware? Well, we can say once a month, once a year, probably, almost certainly at some point in the next few years. It's really hard to calculate that risk thing without a real understanding of how exposed we are to the threats that we face. And I think that for me is a key bit that we need to, and we're getting much better technologies now in terms of sort of breach attack simulation platforms and that sort of end of thing, where we can actually look at running the threat scenario end to end for the latest piece of Conti ransomware against the controls that we have on our network. So I think that's the bit that's going to give us the real steer towards how exposed are we to the threats, And therefore, where and how is that going to impact us? And then we can start to think about that quantification of impact thing. So, and that's one of the biggest risk challenges we have, because just layering generic risk stuff onto cyber, for me, just doesn't really work. It helps communicate, but I think we can do the communication in terms of awareness and understanding of the threats and the risk and the posture that we've got and the investment versus that sort of thing. For me, I think that feels very much more relationship and awareness and education. And actually, if we can get closer to the threats, I think we can do a much better job at quantifying and really sort of enabling us to start talking about impact and risk quantification.
Yeah, thanks, Lee. That makes a lot of sense. We've spoken already about the limited cybersecurity awareness of some of these folks that we're reporting into. Is there a sort of strategy or a general sort of order of prioritization of what you communicate, basically, for the right level of information for them to make better decisions? How do you prioritize what information you report or you communicate? That's to anyone on the panel.
Okay, I'll say keep it simple. I think if introducing sort of risk or complex risk or quantified risk, I think overcomplicated to start with. I think what I found is you can kind of end up running down rabbit holes. And it's that situation, right, I've got this amazing metric which says that, that if this thing happens, and I've decided it's going to happen once every 12 months and it's going to impact you by this. I think without working with them to help put those numbers together, which would be my first bit of advice, is ask them what the business impact would be. Realistic scenario, what would the impact to your business be? So, going back to Domino's, supply chain people, what would the impact be to your business if if you had no operational technology or this particular machine wasn't working for 2 weeks? What's the impact to your business? Because then we start thinking about business continuity planning and those sorts of things from a bit more of a resilience perspective. But I think just keeping it simple is really, really important. I think engaging with them individually, again, I think is really, really important. And by getting to understand what they care about and how our business, but their business unit and entity works and what their targets are, is going to give you the steer that you need to learn how to communicate with them. And not communicating to, I don't know, an ops board of, say, 15 senior directors in the same language. If you're going to do that, then that's great, but wind it back to the most kind of, the simplest factor possible, but then work with them individually to start to get to know their worlds a bit better. That would be my overarching advice, because starting the conversation with complex things, you're probably going to get challenges that maybe you haven't thought about. You're going to get kickback that maybe could have been overcome by, engaging personally first. And so again, it's going to be a fairly common factor for me. I think that is the whole thing. But I think keep it simple would be my advice, and then build up on it. And don't give them data that doesn't make any sense. First thing I said to the board of Domino's is, I can't report on anything at the moment because I don't actually have any data that I can trust. So I can't do it. What I'll do is I'll phase and we'll develop the reporting as we go along. But right now, it's all pretty red because I've done an initial risk assessment and we haven't got a lot in place. So let me just work on doing the right things. And as we get the data, then I can feed you more things that make sense to you, not make sense to me.
Any further thoughts on that, Sarah?
Yeah, I think it's really important. Lee sort of touched on it already. We're talking about from a business continuity perspective, and that is my background historically. I come from business continuity, disaster crisis management, and it's really about articulating the crown jewels. So what exactly are we here to protect and why? And that might sound like an obvious question for some, but actually it's really important that they understand that there's probably been a lot of, well, hopefully there's been a lot of work to articulate that in particular, an understanding of the impact to each element of the business that we talk about. And therefore, what's the priority of all of these things that we have in our business? What exactly is the number one priority? What's our key products and services? But I think the other thing I find important, particularly, as I say, from that sort of crisis management perspective, what I tend to see is when we're talking about impacts, a lot of companies put financial impact as kind of one of the key indicators, and kind of people impact kind of comes 3, 4 down on the list. And what I would encourage people to do is to flip them around, is to make sure that the impact on people is number one consideration. So whether that's your employees, it's your customers, partners, because when you have an incident that really hits the fan, that is what people are interested in ultimately, is what's the people impact? What are you doing to protect people? And that could be people's data, could be people's livelihood, could be all of these things. But when you put people priority first, it changes the mindset of the board and of the organization, because inadvertently, if they put finance first, it basically says that they value profit over people. Now, that is probably not what they actually mean, but I think it's just really important just to make sure that we have that perspective on things and getting the board to really think about what's important. The other thing I would just say as well, picking up on a point that Lee made, is I also feel that there is a tendency to not want to report bad news to the board. And I've been in this situation where you've got kind of lots of reds and things are really wrong and projects are out of alignment, and we're just like, oh, the board, can we reword it? Can we kind of change the factors? Can we change the KPIs? Because we don't really want to be reporting bad news. We want them to feel like everything's working as it should be. The problem then is that when something really goes wrong, and goes wrong to the extent that we're talking about, there's a massive cyber attack, massive breach, there's a massive disconnect between what the board thought they know versus what the reality is. And so we have to, again, think about that mindset of we have to report the reality, no matter how bad it is, and therefore be able to articulate, well, this is the current state of affairs. This is where we stand on those crown jewels, and protecting those crown jewels and protecting the people and doing all the things. And therefore, when you articulate at that level, people then have a better understanding and appreciation for what you're trying to do. So I would really kind of encourage people first and foremost to be open and transparent, no matter how bad it is, because they will thank you in the long run. They might not like to see the reds and ambers, but ultimately, the more we have that level of transparency, the more you're going to get people on side ultimately and get that level of support you need.
Yeah, I think the biggest challenge for me in that one has been where you've got, say, a CIO who's built all the risk into the IT that they built, and now you've got to go and tell the business that actually all the stuff that the CIO has been telling you isn't exactly quite true, and what has been built isn't exactly what he thinks has been built, or he's just completely bottom drawn all the risks that's been raised by the security team. And again, it comes back to relationships. I mean, dealing with that type of scenario is hugely challenging. How do you go and tell on your boss to the business I think that happens quite a lot, and I think again that's a relationship thing, and I think it's very easy for security to get trapped in that IT sort of mentality, isn't it? Which is not actually articulating risk. You're just here to be the fall guy normally to any problems, and I think that's a challenge. But again, that's building relationships with people outside of IT, with people across the C-suite, even not necessarily the C-suite, and depending on the organization that you work for, it might just be more conversations with a senior finance manager. It might just be more conversations with more people in other departments, not necessarily at that board level, and just building those relationships. And then that's the bit that's going to help you to start to break down that sort of IT versus all that security says no type thing, because you can be a trusted resource for them, be a trusted advisor, be somebody who's actually seems to be helping them do things in their world more securely, for instance, because I think that's really our ultimate game here, isn't it? So yeah, absolutely right, Sarah. I just did that dynamic challenge of kind of telling on IT is a big problem.
Thanks, Lee. And we're already talking about some of these effective strategies that you found useful, and hopefully the folks joining today can take away. I'm looking for a couple more of those practical top tips war stories, what's worked for you in cyber risk communication, do's and don'ts. That whole, what are the key practical takeaways that folks can go away with today? And I'll come to you first, James, if you don't mind.
Sure. I'll share a couple, and then I've probably got 7 others, but I'll limit myself. One is the notion of rubber ducking or having a board muse. If I look at one of the most classic things that goes wrong in communicating risk to the board, it is either chronic oversharing or chronic undersharing. So it's I don't want to tell them that because that might, create alarm and we can handle it. Or well, I should tell them about every inch of risk in this place so they really understand it and they want to come on the journey with me. Pro tip, they don't. It's information overload. You have to prioritize aggressively to the things that really matter. It truly is a case of less is more. But if less is more and undersharing can get you in trouble when a breach happens later and you didn't communicate something, how do you calibrate it? Two ideas for you. One is find someone to be your board muse, someone else who has to share with the board in regularity, a complex domain. Finance is a good one. There's always more going on in finance than you could share than a board meeting can cover. They have to ruthlessly pick 2. Make a friend and say, hey, can I get 5 minutes to talk through this and see if this is board worthy or maybe less so? That really helps to have someone to sounding board. Am I over or undersharing in the art of this communication challenge? The other one that I'd share quickly, consider using a cyber risk model. This can really help because there's a standardized process. You can add confidence by virtue of the fact that you're following a professional model as opposed to rolling your own. That can come with pros and cons. These can have overheads to implement. They can come with a fair bit of paperwork. NIST SP 830, one of the common ones, fairly heavyweight. But a cyber risk model does let you, standardize your process and practice and build confidence that you're doing it, as opposed to being too artistic with your expression of risk. There are other frameworks too, and of course you can right size them to your organization. So those would be 2 quick tips from me: a board muse to kind of validate over or undershare, and using a framework. I would suggest as good starters for 10 as do's and don'ts.
Thanks, James. And a super quick reminder to the audience to please send through any questions. We'll address them at the end of this talk. Sarah, have you, from experience, found any of these models useful? Any metrics that you've particularly leaned on? What's proven successful in your communications with the board?
Yeah, I think context is critical. I think that's the number one thing I would sort of say. And this is a constantly evolving, moving beast. So what you thought the threat landscape looked like last month or last year, or what it's going to look like 6 months from now, is constantly moving. And so you have to be cognizant of the risk, how it's evolving, how it's affecting you, your sector, and all of these different things. Because I think what's important is the attackers are always trying to counteract everything that you've put in place. So I think it's important to note that the companies of whatever size have already made a lot of investment in cybersecurity. This is not a new thing, a new risk that we suddenly have to think about. So arguably, a lot of companies say, well, I've already bought tools, I've already have technology, I do monitoring, I've got security analysts, I've got all the things, I'm managing my risk, but the risk of being attacked is still really high. And that's because However we train people, whatever technology, they will always find a workaround. And that is the kind of the job of the attacker, in essence, is to counteract everything that we're doing. And so it's really important that, first of all, the board understand that it's constantly moving. With regards to what we were kind of planning for previously may have been trumped by something else. But I want to give you a little bit of perspective on Microsoft and how we manage our risk, particularly from a security perspective, because I think it's quite different. It might actually be quite unique in some ways to how others might be approaching it, because our business, our day job is technology. And we are the most second attacked entity in the world, believe it or not. So I think we're only second to the US Department of Defense. So attackers are either trying to get access to Microsoft or Microsoft customers. And when we're talking about the cloud and the cloud infrastructure, then so many different companies of different sizes are reliant on whatever Microsoft has kind of put in place to manage, support the platform itself. So from Microsoft's CISO perspective, they look at the threat landscape. And so we are actively tracking approximately 300 large-scale actors. So these can be nation-sponsored actors, these could be ransomware operators. And each one of those had a modus operandi, if you like, what they do, how they do it, what are they trying to get access to. And we have this this assumed compromise mindset is all part of a zero trust strategy, and you're constantly verifying exactly what's going on. You have that assumed compromise mindset, as I sort of said. But if you look at it backwards in terms of understanding the threat actor in particular, and it doesn't really matter that you don't have to look at it from each individual perspectives. But if I'm a nation-sponsored actor with lots of resources and capability, what can I do? How do I do it? How do I get access? What am I getting access to? And assuming I can get access into that bit of data, that infrastructure, how much will, how much persistence, how much motivation do I have to perform a particular action? And that's looking across all of those different actors, knowing how they're evolving, and therefore all of the things that Microsoft has to have in place to counteract all of those capabilities that threat actors might have been building or evolving. And so some of that might be, what's our strategy around access and identity management? What's our strategy around the data in particular? What's our strategy around the people? Each of those are evolving, and what happens is they all get summarized into a report that the CEO, so Satya Nadella, and his board of directors see the threat landscape, see the threat actors, see how they're evolving, and based on all the things that we have in place, are those things still acceptable? Do they have to evolve? And some of that comes back down to our engineering teams, in essence. So what are you doing to evolve all the products and the services that we provide to customers? And so arguably, a company like Microsoft or a big cloud service provider has to run higher and faster than most other companies. It's incredibly difficult to do. Okay, we have a lot of resources, so this is our day job in essence, but it's on us to be able to have that picture, and on us to be able to articulate that threat landscape outwards, whether that's to CISOs, CIOs, or whoever the case may be, so they can understand the threat and they can articulate that to their board. And ultimately it comes down to that level of posture management, because you're never going to be 100% secure. And so I think that's a part of the mindset that we have to. You're never going to say, we're 100% done now, I've got all the technology, I've got all the process, I've got all the people, because it's constantly moving. And so that's what they were saying, it's understand the crown jewels, what's the impact to those, and where are we today in terms of that level of posture management, the level of security process we've put in place, and how do we keep evolving? How do we keep moving forward? And so I just wanted to kind of share that as a principle from Microsoft. That might be quite helpful for some people and how they're thinking about articulating the threat or articulating some of those key performance indicators.
Yeah, I love that. Thanks so much, Sarah. And Lee, we're a little short on time, but really want to hear from you on this. Any other top tips or strategies that you've relied on heavily that's helped you meaningfully?
Again, I kind of go back to keep it simple. So I think probably just a bit of a summary from both of those. So I think certainly a subset of the board as kind of an information security steer code is useful if you work in a bigger business and sort of having problems trying to kind of just go and present back to 12 people every day, and that's sort of your only, or every month or every quarter, and that's sort of your only interaction with them. So I was finding kind of that subset, so that stooge, that sort of security sponsor, you know, that person that can help you sort of go, well, actually, I don't understand what that means. If I don't understand what that means, then they're not going to understand what that means. So help me understand, and I'll help you articulate that. So I think that's hugely important. And I think we have missed a lot of helping the business understand the threat. As Sarah said, we just don't do it. So again, I think keeping it really simple and helping the business understand what a really basic ransomware attack looks like, using pretty pictures and, you know, and on one PowerPoint slide, and there's plenty of stuff out there that can help you do that. Just walk them through it. How does that whole thing work? I mean, when I was at Hewlett Packard, we were very good at articulating what that bad guy ecosystem looks like. You know, what does it really look like? Well, it's organized crime. You know, we have an environment that the threat actor will do that bit, and then they'll sell to that person, and then they'll go and get an exploit, and they'll do the mapping of the environment, and then those two things together will get sold to somebody else, and then it comes down the line. And I think once they start to understand the real world of how all this stuff actually works and how ransomware works, then that's the bit that helps them kind of go, oh, actually, this isn't just a thing that happens to somebody else, or this is, wow, okay, I didn't realize that. So I think helping them understand the reality of the situation in really, really simple language is hugely important, and certainly get somebody to help you get that messaging across effectively. I think they're probably the two big things for me. And then obviously, how do they talk about risk? Are they a risk business? Do they understand risk? Does all the board understand risk, or is it only the CFO? Because that'll help kind of guide you in terms of, you know, are you thinking about risk in terms of a 4x4 box set? I don't particularly like that, but you know what? If the business has that model, I'm going to use it because it's language they understand. So I think getting closer to the language that they understand in all of those different elements of their business and how they understand risk, I think it is vital as well.
Awesome. Thanks, Lee. Okay. Unless there's anything else, we can move on to Q&A, but any last additions, or can we move on?
Teeny tiny one on the backside, but super quick, and let's do the Q&A. You know, you can't measure risk for what you don't know you have. It is important to know the lay of the land, to know the assets you've got, to understand the scope of the business, and to do that exercise regularly. If you're looking at 1/4 of your estate surface area and 1/4 of your business and trying to explain risk holistically, it isn't going to go well. So make sure you continually reevaluate, you know, discovery and breadth as a part of this process. And you know, last thing I'd say is practice before you do it with the board. Run a few cycles of this risk management process of building the reports, of communicating it. Run it with your team, and see if you buy what you're selling before, you know, you go and do this with senior individuals. If you're still not sure, get help. You know, get some advice from experts externally that have done this stuff before and help you sharpen your practice. It's really easy to burn credibility on this stuff. It's hard to do it well, but I do believe it's one of the thematic crucial practices that defines security leadership from here on out. I think it is the job, it is the profession. So be selfish for a moment, have a practice run and make sure you come across well. Sorry, Georgia, I wanted to put those on the end for people shamelessly worrying about their careers.
Not at all. And that's actually a perfect segue. We've got the first question from someone who is who's wondering, you know, they've got very good, strong communication skills, but they sometimes feel like their age carries a negative limitation on the messages they're able to convey. So their question is to the whole panel: are there any suggestions you'd make for someone who's young and trying to build relationships and respect with C-suite executives?
Yeah, I don't mind taking that one first.
Please, please, Sarah.
So I would.
And I'll get it wrong after.
So it really comes down to the culture of the organization first and foremost, in terms of encouraging every person to have a voice. And I think one of the things we say a lot in security is we absolutely need diversity of thought, diversity of perspective, in particular. And so if your organization is set up in a good way, is to consider reverse mentoring. And so you need to remember, people on the board are still people. They might be maybe a slightly older generation, but to have the perspective of a young person is actually really, really valuable, but do it in reverse as well. And so that sometimes we think about mentoring is you have a kind of a senior mentor, but it's actually very, very valuable to have a junior mentor, believe it or not, as well. And I've seen this work really, really well in the company I used to work for at Fujitsu, where they really encouraged even like graduates who are coming fresh in from university to meet the highest people in the organization, just to have a chat, have a coffee. So don't feel you have to go straight in and have these kind of board level conversations, but just to be able to understand their perspective, where they're coming from, how the world's changed, because I think we all have our little blinkers on sometimes. What we think and our perspective might be different from the perspective of a different generation or a different culture even. And so just having those conversations, understand what's important to me, what's important to you. And so when you have those conversations, you can you're at the right level in terms of how you're talking and how you're doing things. But I would just say a lot of it does come down to culture, but if you have the opportunity to do that kind of level of reverse mentoring, it's hugely valuable.
Thanks, Sarah. Lee, James, any thoughts on that?
Go on, James. I'll let you get it wrong first.
Yeah. I resemble this remark. So one of my first senior leadership appointments was at 25, and I struggled with this a lot for two reasons. One, because when I knew the answer, I didn't have enough grey hair, and two, because I was an arrogant little shit and I thought I knew the answer. And that happened a lot too. So I'm sure you're not the second one, but the first one may be a problem for you. Ask for help. One of the best things you could do is politely and with brevity, totally acknowledging Sarah's point about culture, which is pertinent. Find someone in that group. For me, it was it was the CTO in my first instance, and say, hey, I'm trying to communicate this stuff. I'm trying to do it respectfully to everyone's time. I think I have the right information. I think I have the right perspective. But I haven't done this before and I need help. You clearly do it well. What tips can you give me? Could you spend 5 minutes and help me sharpen this up? Some will say no. A surprising number of senior people will be refreshed by the reflectiveness that you want to do the job well and help. The approach that is often taken that goes wrong is comes across with arrogance or presumption. Just ask for some help and be humble in your approach, but don't waste their time. Again, depends on the culture, to Sarah's point, but I've had really good luck with that approach and learned a lot from asking senior folks to give up 5 minutes, and then just make sure you don't waste their time. Like, be punchy, be prepped.
Thanks,
Yeah,
James.
absolutely. It's a challenge, isn't it? But it won't be too long if you're running a cyber team before you've got grey hair like me, and hopefully you'll be all right. So it's just a matter of time, I think, as a practitioner. I would agree. I would also advise on, a lot of listening, not a lot of telling. I would suggest. If you can engage with that audience, I'd say it kind of comes back a little bit to the sponsor as well. Finding somebody who can help you have those kind of conversations, and ultimately, regardless of what your age is, if it's bedded into data and you have a senior person on the board that's supporting you and helping you, nobody's really going to be able to question what you're talking to them about. But if you can build relationships with them individually, a lot of listening, an awful lot of listening. Find out about them. What are they interested in? Everybody likes talking about themselves. So when you're working with it, it's not about security. It's about you understanding and their world, their business, their time. And I think that automatically helps get you respect, because you're not just trying to do security to them or talk to them about your world. You're actually engaging with them and understanding their world, and I think that will hopefully help sort of gain a bit of traction, a bit of understanding, and help you get over that. I get it; it's difficult, but yeah, those would be the two things I think from my perspective.
Appreciate it. Great. All right. And now we've had a couple of questions asking the same sort of thing, but namely around budget cuts. How can you approach the discussion around risk in the climate of falling budgets? So if we could have a responder give a quick one-liner, that would be awesome.
It's their risk, it's their decision. If they're not going to spend any more on the cyber, it's going to be their problem. And it's trying to find that balance. Where does that red line stop? If your red line's going to stop here, or if it's going to stop there, if they're going to give you no budget at all, it's about it being their risk. It's not cyber risk, it's business risk. And regardless of the climate, if you can help articulate the threat, the risk, the impact to their business based on real world things happening today, and they take the decision not to invest the money or to invest. I mean, I always go with A, B, or C, right? You want gold, silver, or bronze. That's your choice. We can either do that, and you're going to accept that level of risk, or that level of risk. You go with one or the other. It's your choice. Make it their choice. Help them understand the risk. Make them draw that line.
I love that, and to be really pithy about this, to Lee's wonderful summary, risk management is how you manage budgets. I mean, it's actually the point. So when you're in a season of falling budgets, your risk management matters even more, because you're forced to take more risk because there's less money to mitigate. It's when you double down on it to pick the right risks. And with Lee's, bronze, silver, gold, platinum, unobtainium, whatever the tiers are, unobtainium. Oh, I like that one. You require this process to be even harsher and make the right calls when budgets are lower. So keep repeating, we've got less to spend, we can mitigate less, our risk management has to be better, or we're going to pay more overall when these risks that we poorly decide on come to fruition. That's good advice from Lee. Keep the focus on the risk stuff even harder.
Thanks, James. And I'm going to take a risk myself and squeeze in this last question.
I like what you did there. That was good.
Thanks. Any advice for getting the board ready to deal with the risks of new technologies, e.g. generative AI, and understanding the risks, impact, threat landscape, etc., of things that we have not done or seen yet?
Yeah, I'll take that one. And it's very similar to what I was saying about articulating the threat landscape, but also looking at the longevity of current investments, because the board and the company, for that matter, don't want to be in perpetual cycle of digital transformation. So I've invested in this product. It's going to take me 18 months to roll it out. By the time I get to 18 months, another things happen, another product's needed. I'm in this perpetual cycle. So we want to think about the threat landscape. We want to think about the investments that we've made, but we want to be thinking about how the threat landscape is going to change over the next year, 3 years, 5 years, even if you can go that far out. And does the investment I have today still work, or do I have to kind of keep evolving of the threat landscape? And it's not just about technology, it's the threat in general. So we've got geopolitical risks, you've got regulatory requirements, so many things are on the horizon. So we can't just think about the here and now. That articulation of risk and how that's going to change and the priorities going to change has to be that rolling cycle that we talked about. So it's really important that context that I talked about earlier is really thinking about the future as well as the current landscape.
Thanks, Sarah. Okay, we're just coming up to that time. To finish up, I will ask each of you to give just your one-liner key bits of practical advice to the folks listening today. And then to close the session, it would just be a big thank you to our panelists, a reminder that there will be a recording of this session in your inboxes very shortly. Please feel free to share it with your nearest and dearest. And lastly, we'll be sending a survey out. So please do let us know your feedback. We actually read them and take into consideration what you say. Any feedback is incredibly useful. So James, I'll come to you first. Just your key takeaway for folks listening today, please.
Got it. Pick carefully. Don't undershare, don't overshare. Don't let the information that really matters get lost in the noise. Work on that balance. Pick the metrics that really matter, not 1,000 of them. And as much as you're interested in the geeky details, share the information that works for your stakeholders shamelessly. This is a communication and buy-in exercise. Focus on what matters to the business and practice that with some friends before you go do it for real. Thanks,
James. Sarah?
Yeah, I'm going to end on a positive if I can, which is not.
You're not allowed to do that in InfoSec, Sarah. You can't. That's not how we roll.
Not every risk is a negative. So actually, there is a huge amount of opportunity if you stop looking at security as a cost center necessary evil and think of it as a business enabler and how we actually manage trust. So I just wanted to end on that high, even though James won't let me.
Thanks, Sarah. Lee?
I would say for any sort of more technology related people out there, get yourselves on a sales course. How does sales work, right? Because that's all about selling stuff. Your kind of job is to sell cyber to the board. Keep it simple. The board are only human beings, and generally human beings are happy to help. Find a sponsor on the board that's going to help you tailor some messages and tailor those messages. As somebody posted about talking about different types of risk, absolutely right. It's tailored for that right audience. And don't make sure it's their problem, not your problem.
Thanks so much. So thank you once again to everyone joining today, to our panelists. We've had some excellent pro tips. Remember, it's a process, it's a journey, but it's one that really matters to CISOs. There's lots of opportunities to get it right, wrong. So make sure you apply these tips, take a look at the handout, rewatch the webinar if you need to, and remember, help is available. So do get in touch if you need that, but otherwise, best of luck applying these practices. And thanks again.
Cool.
Thank you.
Thanks all.
Bye.